Hello everyone, welcome back. Now in this video I will talk about Linux. So this is part 1 of the series. In this series I'll try to cover most of the topics related to Linux. Now this is for anybody who wants to learn Linux. There was a time where Linux administration or Linux user used to be a lucrative job, and there used to be a lot of jobs in the market. But nowadays, believe me, Linux is a must know skill for anybody who wants to explore their career as a cloud engineer or cloud architect or a DevOps engineer, or in the field of security, in the field of DevOps, in the field of SRE. Anywhere Linux is the key. um, Let's jump back in the video. First of all, let me introduce myself. I'm Sushil. I have more than a decade of industry experience. I'm a certified cloud and DevOps architect. I have a bunch of other certifications as well. I'm passionate about fitness and technology, and I share my knowledge using the techguy.in. That is my blog. Now, as I mentioned, this will be a series. It will be a 7-part series. In this one, we will just talk about the introduction, and I'll just introduce about the Linux kernel, about very basic fundamental commands. In the next part, we will deep dive on the commands, the must-know commands that anybody should know. The part 3 will deep dive on the file system management, how you deal with users, groups, file owners, file permissions, everything related to file system. The part 4 and deep dives on the package management and software installation. Part 5 deep dives on the process management and system monitoring, about PS, about top, about anything related to processes. And the sixth one will deep dive on the networking and the network configuration, monitoring network. Fifth, scenario based topics I'll also talk about. And the last one, we will finally touch base on the scripting. I'll show you basic scripts. I'll talk about modules, functions, loops, variables, anything related to automation I'll try to cover. So let's jump back in the video. This one, as I mentioned, I'll briefly introduce you to Linux. Now, first of all, what is really Linux, and why do we really talk so much about Linux? Now, Linux, I mean, most of you might have worked on Windows throughout their career, or they have pretty vast experience in Windows. But trust me, when you talk about enterprise, everything is on Linux. I agree, people do use Windows, but most of the underlying infrastructure is really dependent or deployed on Linux. Now, I've been working more than a decade, so I've seen racks and I've seen data domains, I've seen underlying hardwares also. Everything is deployed primarily on Linux. Why? Because first of all, Linux is an open source and operating system. You really have licensed versions also, but it all originated from the open source. So you have Ubuntu, you have Debian, you have open source operating systems, which makes it really easy to use, and it has a wide community support also. Now, Linux was written or developed by Linus, who released it in 1991, and it was free and customizable, as I already mentioned. Linux is based on something called Linux-like kernel, which I'll talk in next slides. Kernel provides you really flexibility and stability and security, and kernel gives you really high level of flexibility on what kernel you really want, how you want to customize your kernel, and what you really want to do with your system. And why you should really learn Linux? Because as I mentioned, everything, every major deployment or the industry uses Linux. If you want to jump into DevOps, if you want to jump into cloud computing, cybersecurity, Linux is something that is really used widely. Now, what is really kernel? And our kernel is something that enables, if you have seen my previous videos, in one of the videos I talked about virtualization. Kernel is a similar concept. Kernel is what enables communication of applications with the hardware. When I talk about hardware, hardware is nothing basically your CPU, memory, and the hard disk, or the storage. So all the applications that are running on your machine needs to use these hardware, right? They need some sort of processing, they need the memory, they need the storage. Now, how do those applications really access this? Kernel is which comes in, and kernel is that enables this communication and use. That is all about kernel. Now, in kernel, we have multiple subsystems. We have process scheduler, MMU, we have virtual file system, we have networking, and the inter-process communication unit. I mean, this is not something that you'll really deal with a lot, but you must know what is kernel if you are really talking about Linux. Now, what is process scheduler? As I mentioned, these applications need to use these resources. So we are essentially talking about processes also. So process scheduler is really responsible for allocating these resources. Then when I say process scheduler, I'm really talking about the processing, about the CPU. Then the memory management unit takes care of your RAM, the memory. Similarly, virtual file system takes care of your file system, and the networking unit takes care of your networking, and the inter-process communication takes care of your IPC communication, the inter-process, because there are a lot of processes which needs to talk to each other also, right? So that is what the Linux kernel subsystem is. If you're really interested to deep dive on this and how the kernel really works, you can Google and you can really find a lot of content about Linux kernel subsystems. Now, this is something that you must know. As I mentioned, kernel is something that you should be aware of, but this is something that you must know. There are multiple Linux distributions or flavors. I call it flavors in my daily terminology, but you can also call it Linux distributions. And we have Ubuntu, we have CentOS, we have Debian, we have Red Hat, RHEL as we call, we have SUSE also. Now, what this really means is these have different characteristics. They have different package manager. This is they have a different fundamental way of working, but essentially how we really deal with these flavors and distributions is essentially similar. As a normal user, you'll not really see a lot of difference with these distributions. Now, Ubuntu is something that is widely used. I'm sure you would have heard also. Ubuntu is first of all free. It is open source, and you really do not need any license for Ubuntu, and it has a very strong community support. Any dev or any labs anywhere, you would mostly see Ubuntu. CentOS is known for stability and long-term support, and it is favored for mostly the server deployments. Debian is also used for known for the stability and package management, but Debian is something that you will really see in the enterprise environment. Similarly, Red Hat you will also see in the enterprise environment, because it is really popular about its security and reliability, and it has a good support also. Again, Red Hat is licensed. Similarly, SUSE is licensed, and that is why, because it is licensed, which means it has great support also, and it offers enterprise grade features also. So in the enterprise environments, you'll mostly see Red Hat and SUSE, and somewhere Debian. CentOS, Ubuntu, you will really see. CentOS mostly you will see in the server deployments, but Ubuntu you might see in dev or the lab environments. But how do you really decide which one you need? And it completely depends on specific use case. What is that you are trying to achieve with your environment or with your machine, and what kind of support do you really need? What are your preferences? That really decides what flavor you want to use. Now, before jumping in this, let me, because I talked about kernel, let me show you what I really mean about kernel. Now, I can use this command to see where I am working on. I mean, this is my machine name, but I'm using Linux and I'm using Ubuntu. This is my Ubuntu version 2004, and this is my kernel. This is the kernel I'm talking about. This is my Azure machine, which is why they say there you see an Azure kernel. But if I really want to check what kernel I I'm using, I can just use kernel -r tells me what kernel I'm using. So this is what I was really talking about. I'm using Ubuntu 2004 and I'm using 5.15.1041 Azure kernel. Now let's jump back in the commands. In this video, I'll briefly touch base on the most common commands, and this is something that you must know even if you do not really want to become a Linux expert. This is something that you'll deal with day in day out, and nowadays because Linux is so popular, PowerShell started supporting these commands also, so you can run most of these commands. I think grep doesn't work in PowerShell. chmod obviously will not work in PowerShell, but ls, pwd, mkdir, mcat, all these commands have started supporting in PowerShell also, because they are making it cross-platform supported. So ls, as the name itself supports, tells, ls is really used to list files. cd you can use to change directory. In Windows also it's same. pwd, it is used to print current working directory. You can also name it as, we can call it as a present working directory also. If you want to see which directory you are in, you can use pwd. You can use mkdir to create a directory. Again, similarly in Windows also, rm you can use to remove files and directories depending on what parameter you give. You can use -r, -f. -r would actually delete all the directories also. cat you can use as to display your file contents. grep helps you search. Using grep you can use different parameters again, and you can search for a particular pattern within file, folder, anywhere you are trying to do. chmod, I'll deep dive on this in our part 3, but chmod helps you change file permissions, and sudo helps you run anything with the super user privileges. Now, in a typical environment, production environment, in a real scenario, you will your account will be created, right? And you'll be given permissions to do tasks that you are expected to do. Mostly you will have restricted permissions, and if you really want to run something with the elevated privilege, for example, you want to execute something, a script, for example, if you want to install something or you want to delete something, those permissions or those tasks require elevated privileges. You can use, or you want to switch user, for example. There can be anything which requires super user privilege. You can use sudo command to run commands with the elevated privileges. So now let's jump back. For example, I see right now, I mean, it really tells you where you are, but sometime, for example, I switch to part 2. Now it is really telling me which directory I am in, to be frank, but I can also use pwd, for example, present working directory. It tells me this is where I am right now, and if I want to see, if I want to list what files I am in, I can just run ls. Now I can use ls-al also. A tells me all, l lists it. Then I can really see which are is directory, with what permissions there are, what are the user, what is root, what is size, and all that thing. For example, I want to do it in a user readable format. I can really use all these things. And for example, I want to grep, as I mentioned, is for search. I can grep bin, and I will grep bin and star. It tells me all these files have bin. For example, loop.sh, it found bin. In this variable.sh, it found bin. So I can really use grep to search anything, and I use star, I want to search it in all the files. We talked about ls. I talked, so you really saw I used cd. For example, I am in this directory, I want to jump back in the parent directory, I can use cd and I go back to this. If I want to again change, I can use cd. So I can use cd really to change. Now if I want to clear my screen, I can use clear. So you got it. ls to list, cd to change, pwd to list, present working directory grep to search. I might not have, okay, I have it. If I really want grep recursive, I can use grep -r also. If you see right now, it just showed me, for example, it just showed me these files, but it did not, when I just use grep bin, it did not really check this directory. So I used grep -r to tell it to check recursively. Then I checked in this folder also. So you can really customize it based on what you really want. And if you see whatever is in green, for example, if I show you this one, I'll deep dive further, but this tells me this file has, I mean, I really have an execute permission on this script, which means I can really run this script, but anything else I cannot, I do not have execute permission. So for example, let me do this, and I would back up. Okay, now using chmod I can really change permissions. So if I really do this, now you see in this one also I have now execute permissions. So using chmod I can really change permissions also. So this is it. In next video I will deep dive further on a lot of other commands which you must know. Now recap, I really talked about Linux, how you can use Linux in DevOps, cloud, why you really need Linux. I mean, why you should really learn Linux. We deep dived on, or we touched base on the most of or the most common commands, and we also talked about the kernel. That's it for this video. I hope to see you in the next videos. Meanwhile, if you have something else that you want me to cover, please share in the comments. Thank you. Have a good day. Bye.